Okay, perfect. So, thank you very much for your time. My mum passed away on first day Chanukah in the end of 2018. I was in Israel at the time, and obviously, I can't believe it's been 6 years. It's flown. So, just before I forget at the end, uh, I just wanted to firstly thank Elan for coming on the show, but also to thank both Elan and Jackie because my mom suffered from frontal temporal lobe dementia. And, they just had the environment where my mom was actually staying there after she sold the house in Donata. And the transition to basically any sort of care facility would have been very traumatic. And between Agnes and the scheduling, it was almost like a normal day as usual, except my mom's cognitive ability deteriorated vastly. But Ilan and Jackie just made it seem like nothing had changed. And I want to thank both of you very, very much. So.
No, no need to.
So this particular shiur, um, my mom was a fan of Rabbi Tats. I mean, Arthur remembers we going to Mouth because even though my mom had a wide variety of interest, if Rabbi Tats spoke at Mouth, she was there. So I'm going to share a few ideas from Rabbi Tats. Obviously, if I bungle it up, that's on me. If it sounds great, it's from Rabbi Tats. Okay, that's the default position. I'm just going to let the snake with fur off the table, this cat. That's here, all the shirim. I know she's generally our mascot or our muscat, but not today. So just give me a second because she's not with it at the moment. Just hang on a second. Just moving the cat away. All right, sit down. All right, so guys, I just wanted to bring up, there was a theme I wanted to cover for many, many years. Many, many years, and that is there's a link between the oral Torah and Chanukah itself. Now, we're going to just go through some of the ideas about how the oral Torah differentiates from the written Torah. It's not meant to be a whole historical perspective, but more conceptual perspective. So, if you have a look, it's not the Chumash or the Bible or the five books of Moses that separates us from the other religions because both the adherents of Islam and Christianity acknowledge the Bible. So where there's going to be a huge distinction is the Torah Shel Baal Peh, the oral Torah, and compared to the written Torah. So basically, if you look at a division of history, it's placed to where the written Torah and prophecy ends. What we dealt with in the shiur last Hanukkah was the fact that there was a junction time. It was basically about 2,300 years ago with the men of the Great Assembly, where there was actually a davening by the sages because idol worship was getting so out of hand that unfortunately the consequence was a lack of prophecy. Because when you're spiritually more attuned, it creates prophecy, but also the this need for idol worship itself. It's almost like a sexual drive. In the right place, it could be in a wonderful relationship between husband and wife and kedusha, but in the wrong place, it could lead to a lot of deviancy and immorality. So we did discuss that the Hanukkah was on the transitionary period between the written Torah and the principle of prophecy, compared with the application of the oral Torah, which was a completely different process. Just hang on a second. I've got the cat biting the mouse cables. Just hang on. Down. Uh, so just to get into it rather quickly, is that it had to change where the decisions were based on principles and our responsibility was to use logical reasoning within those precepts and foundational constructs. And those principles were actually set forward in the oral transmission by Moshe Rabbeinu. It was only put into writing at the point where they were worried that the generations afterwards would forget. Now, just as a matter of interest, there were no halachic arguments according to the Maharal at the point at which there was prophetic transmission. There was nothing to argue about. They could see what the reality is. The first argument was at the time of Rav Yossi ben Yochanan. So what we have is we have Rav Shimon HaTzadik, who was able to transmit the entire Torah. There's obviously Rav Yehuda Nasi, etc., and the teachings of the men of the Great Assembly, because he was the Kohen Gadol. But Shimon HaTzadik, in his name, is a bit of a clue, because Shimon means what, guys? Guys, Shimon means to hear, as opposed to sight. So I was
Shomea.
exactly. The Israel resident knows his Hebrew pretty well. So the issue is, what is the conceptual difference between seeing and hearing? Well, quite simply, when you see an event, you don't doubt it. If a person has to witness a homicide, it's almost instantaneous that you're getting a sense of what's happening, and it's before you in one time juncture. With hearing works where when somebody's talking to you, your brain subconsciously is processing one symbol at a time to make a word, and one word at a time to join together a sentence. And when you're joining a sentence together in a paragraph, you're eventually dawning on you what the person has to say. But unfortunately, it's a sequential understanding and process, much like the oral Torah, where when you have prophecy, boom, it's there. So you're not going to have any halachic arguments. It's different to sequential understanding. If you look at how they have to work out a homicide post facto, you need ballistic forensics, which obviously checks the bullets, the gun, who it belongs to. You've got blood spatter analysts, pathologists to work out how the body died. And piece by piece with evidence, they put it together in terms of what was the picture and what transpired. Now, could you come to the same conclusion? Yes, but the methodologies to come to the same conclusion is very, very different. And that's the understanding of how the oral Torah did develop. One of the things that went wrong at the time of the Greeks is the world was of the opinion that there's only Olam Hazeh, there's no Olam Haba. And at that particular point, there was a Jew, a leader of the generation. His name was Antigonus, which is a Greek name, ironically. It just showed you how far we'd come. And he had two students. Now, one of the students followed the path of the Pharisees, and the Pharisees believed in both the written and oral Torah. Just hang on for me 1 second, guys. Both the oral and written Torah. And the Sadducees did not believe in anything other than the written Torah, because in their mind it was basically invented by the rabbis. In terms of opinion, it was subject to debate, etc. But how did this go wrong? So if you have a look at it, the basis was when you learn from Pikei what Antigonus said, do not serve your master, meaning Hashem, for the sake of receiving reward. Rather serve as servants, not for the sake of reward. So what this meant was, what Antigonus is actually telling you is that you're building a relationship with Hashem. Don't worry about the world to come. Hashem will take care of you if you do the right thing. The whole thing is building a relationship. And also, you do the right thing because not for any ulterior motive. If your parents have looked after you when you're young and vulnerable, it's only gratitude that you look after them when they're old and vulnerable. And therefore, you don't do it because of the brownie points you're going to get in the next world. That's nice, but that's not for your equation, because if you do something for somebody else for selfish motives, that certainly isn't a high level, I can promise you. So what did the Sadducees, Saduki, interpreted as, is said, don't worry about for the sake of receiving reward. In other words, they interpreted as there's no reward in the next world. So how did they get that? Well, it's very simple. According to the Rambam, when you look at the written Torah, there is no mention of Olam Haba in the written Torah. If you look at the Midrashim and the oral sources, etc., it does talk about the spiritual realm in the next world, etc., but it's not mafurish in the Chumash itself. And if you're only holding by the Chumash, you're going to come to the conclusion there is no next world. That's how wrong you're going to go. Further to which, you've got the first argument that occurred was right when Rav Yossi ben Yochanan, you had the argument. There was only one issue of disagreement. It carried on to Hillel and Shammai, And 4 generations later, there were only 3 arguments. But if you look at the students of Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai, thousands of arguments. Sometimes the interesting fact about Gemara is that you learn completely opposite opinions, or you can hold 2 different opinions, and both of them have got validity and are true. And sometimes they're not reconcilable. Sometimes they're applicable in different conditions, etc. So it's that ability to stretch the mind and the soul where the strength of Gemara comes to, because it's not black and white. There are a myriad of nuances that are involved. Um, one of the problems is as you went further, apart from where you go wrong, where you see there's no next world for the Jewish people, coming from the Jewish people, you've got an issue of Rav Yehoshua ben Prachia's student, who was JC. He was the founder of Christianity, and it discussed this in Gemara Sanhedrin when we were learning it with Rav Simcha Steinhauer. Obviously, in a lot of editions, they removed it. But in Gemara Tainis, it said when JC was born, that was the day that Ezra died. And that wasn't a coincidence, too. The minute Ezra died, the level dropped to where such an error could occur. Because in the time of prophecy, you couldn't come to a conclusion of Christianity because you just knew what the truth was. So obviously that clarity would never happen in a prophetic era. So one of the principles of this Talmud that we discussed is the fact that you could have completely dissenting views and they both make sense. But one of the methods that the Torah has in presenting information is it shows you first what's wrong. What's wrong? And then obviously you go through 4 pages of Gemara, guys, we've experienced this, and it establishes a premise. But before you figure out what's wrong, the most logical argument is set forward. Sometimes it's based on logic, sometimes it's based on scriptural reference. And the Gemara takes you on a journey where for 4 pages, you're actually 100% sure there can be no other alternative. And it takes you down this path of thought, and eventually it shows you the crack in terms of why it's wrong. Now, this isn't the way any scientific journal works, because how does it work? It presents an axiom and builds layer of complexity upon those hypotheses, but it's based on that axiom. It's not, they don't present irrational mathematics and then correct it. But this is not irrational, because what it does is it shows you and trains your mind and your soul in terms of a way to think. But it has to almost seem like reality, and then you pick the nuances of what's gone wrong in order to get an understanding of what's right. And you've got 2 different sorts of principles within the Gemara. You've got what you call a Havamina. And what's a Havamina? It means I would have thought. Quite literally, that's what it means. So it refers to an initial assumption or proposed explanation within a Talmudic discussion. And what's the purpose? It presents the first interpretation or reasoning or possibility that's considered when approaching a text or a halachic question. But it's an idea that might later be accepted, refined, or even rejected. So in other words, it sets forth the train of thought, and you go through an exploration of that. Eventually, you've got different arguments that transpire, and then you've got a maskana. So what does that mean? It literally means the conclusion or final ruling. So it's basically the resolution of the issue after having the Havamina, and that's analyzed and debated. And the whole purpose is you need a conclusion to the argument, because that allows for proper interpretation of the text. Sometimes logically it makes sense, but it has to work as a priority of the Chumash being the actual source, which trumps even logic. So there's a mixture of textual referencing, rationale, and basically the maskana is the final conclusion or halachic ruling that we derive from that. So Talmudic learning is mainly a learning of perception. So we don't actually deal, Chanukah is actually like Purim, a post-prophetic miracles that have occurred. And it's so hidden, it's actually sandwiched between the laws of Shabbos lighting candles, and it's not even in the Mishnah. So it means the Mishnah was obviously came about first. So that's how involved it is within the Oral Torah, and that's why the Oral Torah is a theme that comes within Chanukah, because it's embedded in it as what separates us from Hellenic thinking. So Just let me give you an example. If you're Sadducees, you're going to see an eye for an eye, il talionis. We learned the law of the claw, being that the Romans implemented to say that if you take out somebody's eye, you can't get revenge by taking out more than an eye. It was almost a restraining clause. But quite literally, it meant you could take an eye for an eye. The Gemara has at least 15 different proofs that, in fact, it's not literal but monetary compensation and couldn't possibly be literal. So the question obviously goes then, why do you write it in such a way that it's not literal? In other words, if you want somebody to perceive it's monetary, why not write it like that? So there's a whole Gemara that Rabbi David Gottlieb goes through with that, which I could share with you guys. But there's a myriad. We're learning Makut. The written Torah says 40 lashes, and the Talmud it actually says 39 lashes. So one of the basis about sending your children to a Torah observant school is that they have to learn Chumash with Rashi. Otherwise, you're going to come out with a Christian literal interpretation. Um, and obviously, a lot of that understanding of Chumash is based on the oral. Now, there is a concept I just want to go through quickly, is that, um, you know, the problem is that most Jews, even Jews that are observant, like Shomrei Shabbos and Kosher, have this strange perception that the Torah is incredibly deep and insightful and wise and understands human nature and describes the world and history. And there are many philosophies that are similar. In other words, they look into the world, they've got a deep understanding of the human condition, of history. You've got psychology, you've got Plato and Aristotle. And basically, the Jewish perspective is very, very different. The Vilna Gaon um, brings in certain commentaries a discussion with Gematria. I'll give you the source afterwards if you need, where he actually gives the formula for circumference calculations, pi, and certain other advanced mathematical calculations. So you might turn around and say, well, it's amazing that the Torah knew how to calculate pi. But I remember when I was listening to the shiur of Rabbi Kiva, he says, you're an idiot if you think that. Because what you're doing is you're seeing it the other way around, is that there's a reality, and Torah understands that reality, and therefore it's very wise. When in fact the converse is true, is that the Torah, both the written and oral, create that reality. In other words, it's equivalent almost to DNA. So if I have to show you DNA and that person has blue eyes and red hair and short of stature within the DNA code, and I print out and say, when this child is born, monitor them over the next couple of years, and you turn around to me and say, it's so incredible that your DNA describes how the person turned out. You can't say that, because anybody that knows DNA and genetic coding knows that the DNA doesn't describe the person that develops. The DNA is the person that develops from that DNA. In other words, it's the same, the Vilna Gaon says when you're calculating Torah, is that Torah is the reality, it preceded the world, and the physical manifests the spiritual reality. It's not an observational, very intuitive insight of the world. It is the world and its physical manifestations come from that spiritual reality. And you often see this when you speak to a non-from person. I remember speaking to a very bright guy, wasn't from, and he said to me, you know what, the Torah is very, very smart. Why? Because it basically understood that shellfish have iodine and bacteria, and that pork comes from a pig and it carries tapeworm and hepatitis B. And, that's why it's wise. And it said it's not kosher. And I said, well, these things have a physical manifestation of impurity because they're not kosher. In other words, their non-kosher essence enables them to have a negative effect in the physical world. And you know what? I knew what was coming when the secular Jew said it. You know what he said? He said to me, but today, guess what? They can track these things, hepatitis B and tapeworm, and they give special animal fodder and genetic or engineering so that you can be rest assured that it's okay to eat. You can see where this is going to follow. Then there was a faulty reasoning that went one step further. What's that step further? This person, I just asked them as a matter of interest. So let me tell you something. I said to him, so Shabbos? He said, no, in the old days, it was hard work. You built a fire. You had to kindle a fire, you had to get logs or whatever. It's work. And we have to rest from work, so you can't create a fire on Shabbos. Therefore, these are the restrictions. But today you can put on a microwave and put on a light, and it's not work. So the problem is that the prohibition that describes Shabbos is not avodah, hard work or service. It's actually malocha, and malocha is creative endeavor. So it's not like God got tired like a human being after 7 work days. God withdrew himself from active creation. It's a cessation of creative endeavor. And therefore, obviously, to teach that particular principle. So it's when you start to go in terms of interpretation of why we have these halachas, and it might be very clever, at the end of the day, you're going to end up keeping nothing. So it goes along the path pretty much of the Sadducees. So it would seem a little bit difficult because when you're looking at the oral Torah, you're seeing rabbis with different viewpoints, and you say, well, how can you come up with a clear, unequivocal truth? It leaves no room for error. How do you know what's true? So the reality is the opinion of the sages. Many of them also had an almost a dulled down form of prophecy. It didn't go from prophecy to none. There were transmissions, etc. And obviously things died down in terms of levels over the generation. But one of the things you've got to realize is that we determine Rosh Chodesh, the start of the new moon. So Rosh Chodesh, Rosh Hashanah is the Rosh Chodesh of the new year. So the interesting part is that by obviously seeing, verifying that the moon has come out, etc., we say it's Rosh Hashanah. 10 days later, Hashem judges the world. So if you look at this, our impact of declaring Rosh Hashanah and Rosh Chodesh on the moon sighting and verification of that determines, in fact, 10 days later on the 10th of Tishrei, when the entire world is judged, which means the oral Torah and the sages get to determine reality in terms of when Hashem judges the world. Hashem takes his cue from us in terms of which day the world is judged. Even the festivals, there's leap years, etc. The only thing that doesn't change is Shabbat was fixed by Hashem as a non-variant. But it is interesting that, just to know how much power that the sages actually had. And if you remember, there was this discussion with the Moshe Rabbeinu in terms of the Malachim say that you're not on the level, human beings are not on the level to keep the Torah. And Moshe obviously holds onto the throne of Hashem's glory and explains that these tests were tests of man, and uses different pasukim in the Torah to show that, in fact, it is made for us. So it's in our hands. Just want to bring one or two quick things, and then we'll be done. If you look, we were discussing in the law of six, if you remember, guys, in Makos, and I came across Bava Metzia in the 59th daf. So this is quite interesting. You've got Rav Eliezer the Great, and he was the teacher of Rabbi Akiva. Now, Rav Eliezer didn't agree with the majority of the opinion of the Sanhedrin sages, okay? Because it was a discussion on a vessel, on an oven, etc. And the sages have said that the law is based on the majority. But always there was the case where Rav Eliezer the Great, I mean, you're talking about somebody that was the teacher of Rabbi Akiva, held that the leader of the generation determined and not the majority. Now, it wasn't his ego involved, because there were issues about previous generations which he took instruction from the leader of that generation and not the majority of opinion, which you can understand there's a validity. The vast majority of people might not be as qualified as the leader of that generation, because you must remember the majority of the sages in Rav Eliezer's time were his students. So they were coming at loggerheads there because they weren't in agreement. So how do you resolve it? He basically said that at the end of the day, I'm going to give you a proof. And what he said is that if the law is in accordance with my ruling, then let the carob tree prove it. And the carob tree physically relocated 400 amot. So the carob tree was symbolic of the tradition on which his opinion is based. And the rabbis responded, it's nice you do miracles, but you can't bring a proof from the carob tree. And Rav Eliezer said, all right, I'll give you another proof. If you look at a stream, which is symbolic Kabbalistically of clarity of thought. He said, streams usually go down with gravity. I'm going to make the stream flow upward. And obviously a miracle happened and it was done. Sages didn't budge. They said, basically, you can't bring a proof from a stream. And his last proof is he basically said, if I'm correct, the study hall will prove it and it will collapse. And Rav Yeshua, who was part of the sages, turned around and said to the walls, listen, this argument has nothing to do with you. Don't get yourselves involved in it. You don't have to necessarily go with Rabbi Eliezer. We don't exactly want the base midrash to crash. So in deference to both of them, it almost suspended itself, acknowledging both views. So the last resort was Rav Eliezer said that basically if the law is in accordance with my ruling, let proof come down from the heavens. And there was a divine voice, a buzz call that says, why do you dispute the position of Rav Eliezer? The law is always in accordance with his ruling. You can check this in Bava Metzia 59. Now, Rabbi Yeshua, on behalf of the sages, said, look, it doesn't matter if we hear a divine voice. If you look in Devarim chapter 30, verse 12, it says the law is not in the heavens. Because at a certain point, as Rav Yirmiyah explains in the commentaries, the significance of that statement is once the Torah is given, heavenly voices and miracles no longer play a role in legal discourse, because Hashem has already established a method for resolving legal disputes in the Torah, namely like the ruling of the majority of the sages. How do you know this? You look at Shmot, Exodus chapter 21, verse 1, 23, verse 1, and you shall turn towards the many. That's the proof that we go in the majority. And you have levels. You've got the different Tanaim, but Rabbi Tat said something interesting, which I didn't know. Anybody mentioned in the Gemara had the spiritual ability to revive the dead. Just think about it. Because we often think about rabbis in our time and we say, well, how can they determine? That's a very, very different level. Rabbis today can basically only carry out established halacha. So the bottom line is that it's a different methodology that we use today, using the oral Torah compared to the prophetic era. And obviously, we will come a time when Mashiach, please God, immediately, when we're going to have almost a beautiful combination of the two. So I just wanted to share a couple of ideas with you guys. Yeah, and that's it.
That was very well done, very interesting. And I want to wish you and your brother both a long life.
Thanks so much.
Guys,
Thanks,
I
Kevin.
wanted to keep it short, like my heart. So I didn't want to go.
I had a question for you. You said each of the rabbis in the Gemara could revive it, or was that each of the rabbis in the Mishnah?
No, that's why I was so surprised, because I know the rabbis in the Mishnah were at the level where reviving the dead was centuries before the Gemara. Yeah. So, but he actually said the Gemara, but he might have meant the Tanaim and not the Rishonim. You know, he might have been talking about the first generation. He wasn't specific. It's something I want to ask Anna.
The Rishonim wouldn't be in the Gemara, but
he might have meant, for example, like Rav and Shmuel, or somebody of like quite a stature. I'm not sure, but he didn't say Mishnah.
I know it was common. I know it was commonplace at the time. All right.
So
well done, Dad.
I'm not sure. Do you want to share some ideas? You want to share an idea with us, Elan?
No, I haven't prepared anything, but please God, the learning should just be as good for Chaya Bas Aviva.
Amen.
And an for her neshama.
Amen.
Thanks so much, guys. Appreciate you making the effort as well.
I really appreciate all of you. Thank you so much.
Well done, Damon.
Shkach, Damon, and yeah.
Wish you long life.
Thank you, guys.
Shiur.
Be well.
Thank
Long
you.
life, and your
Bye.
dad and Elan also, yeah.
Okay.
Thanks, guys.
Ciao.
God bless. Ciao.